And you saw Marietta Mendoza really engaging students in a structured discussion task after finishing a critical and rather challenging segment in this unit on child labor. And instead of just throwing the question out to the classroom stratosphere and seeing who might potentially respond, she carefully directed students' attention to the written task. In fact, knowing that she had a few students who had trouble focusing at times on tasks, and a lot of students with auditory processing issues, she actually had photocopied, which I thought was very meticulous, photocopied a page out of the book and made a transparency to really direct their attention to where the question was, and then had them point to it in their actual page in their unit. So she directed their attention to the written task. She also read it aloud to them and had them read it with her. She provided an academic sentence starter to frame their responses instead of just asking them to try to fend for themselves and share something with her or with their partners. She gave them a clear sentence starter and modeled using that sentence starter with them. She also had a word bank to bolster their precise vocabulary use, just as I did in my example, focusing on 8th grade social studies. So she had a clear sentence starter, one that wasn't too intimidating or too far beyond their syntactic reach, but one that incorporated critical vocabulary words from the unit and got them really framing their idea in strict academic discourse rather than casual conversational register. She modeled her response verbally and in writing. And we know that if you just do it verbally, that's a lot for students to hold in auditory storage. So she had written her response up on the overhead, directed their attention to look at how she had written her response, and a strategy that I really endorse, she had them practice using the starter with her response. So they could have sort of a syntactic warm-up, practicing that starter, getting fluent with the starter, so they weren't stumbling with it as they read it to their partner if the student happened to be a less proficient reader. She clarified the grammatical structure, and she pointed out an unfamiliar word in that starter just to make sure that everybody was clear on what they were saying. So if you will, I think that she constructed a response and then deconstructed it and reconstructed it for them. So everybody was very clear on what they needed to do and how they would potentially complete this. She asked students, which I thought was very thoughtful, she actually sort of had a think, pair, and then think again and write. She let students brainstorm with their partner. They thought of their response using the starter, shared it with their partner, and I was very impressed how every single student was able to use the starter after her conscientious modeling. But she got them to actually just partner and share it, and then afterward to go in and write it, and to write out their thoughtful response, and walked around as they were writing their response, helped students who needed a little help in the grammatical or spelling department. Her partnering, it was very evident to me that these students were comfortable partnering, and it was something they did on a daily basis multiple times. No students were looking around what I was supposed to do. They immediately, automatic pilot, turned to their partner, used the starter, used it comfortably and adeptly, and were right on task. As she was sharing, and students reported out afterward, she took a couple examples of students' written work, which I thought was very thoughtful, and that students had written, and she had them actually write their answer on a transparency when she saw that they had actually completed. She sort of nominated a couple volunteers, if you will, took the transparency, put it on the overhead projector, and got students' attention focused up there and gave them an active listening task. She read it aloud, and I think that really honored the student contributors. And she, as students, sometimes if I'm leading a discussion, because students are sort of intimidated to begin, often I'll walk around the room as a spin on what she did, and walk around the room and look at what students are writing or overhear what they're sharing, and pick one or two students to be my nominated volunteers. And the term I use with middle school youths is, you're going to be my discussion jumper cable. You're going to be the person just to jumpstart. And I don't walk around using praising language. I don't want to interrupt anybody's cognitive process, but I'm looking to see what kind of ideas do we have out here in the classroom? Do all students seem to have pretty similar ideas, or do I have a wide array? who are one or two students I could use just to jumpstart the discussion and put a little pep in the process? And it takes a lot of pressure off of everyone just to have a couple of those discussion starters. I don't say that's a great idea, will you share it? I'll just say I'm nominating you to share this idea as our discussion jumper cable, and they know exactly what that means. So this nominated volunteer or discussion jumper cable. Something that she got them to do that she didn't point out, but they were so used to doing, was using their public voice. If they shared aloud with the unified class, that many middle school youths are not apt to do. When I'm observing in classrooms and conducting research, I have great hearing, challenged vision, but great auditory capacity, and about 70% of the time I cannot hear what students are saying. And I'm often the most riveted person on students' responses, and I'm actively listening, but I can't hear them. And it's not a pronunciation or articulation issue, it's an auditory issue. They're not speaking loud enough. And often, because we engage on one-on-one interactions with students, which invites a casual discussion, a casual conversational tone. So it's important to remind students to use their public voices 3 times louder than conversation and 2 times slower. Not when they're talking with their partner, they should be using their private voice, but when they're sharing an idea with the unified class. And I remind them too to use the sentence starter, because at times middle school students get very excited about their ideas and sort of 86 the starter and want to just revert back to familiar habits and blurt out their idea. So I remind them that we're using the starter for an array of reasons. 1, it encourages them to use their public voice. 2, I have targeted, and Ms. Mendoza had targeted vocabulary and grammar that she wanted the students comfortable using, in part because they'd be using it in a subsequent writing assignment. And 3rd, because everybody has a listening job. And in my class, I always assign an active listening task. Listen for one example you hadn't thought of, listen for one idea you disagreed with, and I want to make sure that nobody gets a free ride during the discussion, because many students think, I shared, now I've earned a little 5-minute, upright siesta. So I don't want any cognitive floating going on in the room, or multitaskers, students who are actively on task, but for another class. In my social studies class, they're doing math. So I want to make sure I have an evidence check that everybody's paying attention. And I want to look at that work to see what they've written. Something else we can do as an active listening goal is to infuse our discussions with instruction on different communicative language functions. To participate in classroom interaction, students need to be comfortable using a wide range of functions, from acknowledging other people's contributions, mentioning similarities, reporting a partner's idea, interrupting politely, asking for clarification, and in some cases, recently I taught students how to hold the floor. When they're trying to share their idea and an impatient professional blurter just blurts out the idea, teaching them how to say, if I could get back to what I was saying, or as I was just saying, to let them get back to share their idea. So one critical communicative language function to infuse day 1 with structured interaction is how to acknowledge similarities, so that students are listening as you debrief ideas and listening to see if someone else shared an idea that is essentially what you wanted to share. So I tell them it's not appropriate to say, so-and-so took my idea. Instead, to point out in casual conversation, we might say, oh yeah, I know, or that's right. But in a more formal academic discussion or in writing, we're going to say, my idea is similar to, for example, Jeffrey's, and then to say your whole statement. Or if the idea is quite similar but actually adds some information, I like teaching middle school use the expression, my idea builds upon. So it adds another dimension, and then get them to say their whole statement. This increases the odds, if they're accountable for acknowledging similarities, that they're actively listening, which is not necessarily the forte of many middle school youths. So I want to build in a number of evidence checks, getting them to write something down, getting them to acknowledge similarities. And I typically debrief the discussion long enough so at least one student has to acknowledge something they've heard. And to wrap up, as we facilitate contributions, if students have had a chance to partner first to share or to write an idea and partner, I want to make sure that I randomly call on students. And this is where this sort of discussion jumper cable or nominated volunteer comes in. And why? Because the same students will no doubt If I wait long enough, I know those same students will respond, and unfortunately, by the time students hit 6th grade, they've had years of conditioning that if I hold off long enough, the teacher or 1 or 2 other students in the class will respond. So I'm going to randomly call on a few before I open it up to volunteers. And while we're doing that, no gymnastic hand raising. Just call on a few people, then allow volunteers. Something that I have to watch out for is interjecting my own perspectives on a continual basis, and I see this in fellow middle school colleagues, that it's difficult to refrain from just embellishing on a student's idea, and what can happen if your goal is to get them to contribute is that we interrupt their train of thoughts and we essentially hijack the discussion. So what I suggest is holding off on offering your perspective or offering your elaborations till the end of the discussion, and to synthesize their contributions and then enhance, if you will, and elaborate. Now, a model I just set up there and what you saw in the video clip is for a more, shall we say, full-fledged class discussion on a central topic, as the one I mentioned, the brainstorming topic, where you really want to hear from a range of students about critical issues that newcomers face. Or in this class discussion, students coming up with examples of rules they would like to establish vis-a-vis the topic of child labor. That topic has a lot of conceptual heft and warrants more discussion time, but there are lots of other opportunities in the classroom where I want to briefly interrupt my instruction to get a quick cognitive and verbal response. And I want to revisit one video clip we looked at in my first session, focusing on structured, accountable response to instruction, to look at how Tanya Ward-Singer is getting students in her lesson, preparing them with vocabulary for a writing assignment, getting them to practice using these words and to analyze appropriate context for using them, how she really adeptly gives the students a response frame for sharing their idea and then responding to their partner's idea. Let's watch once again how in a matter of just a couple minutes she sets up the frame and gets students using this response frame. We're going to think about how we can interrupt instruction just as Tanya's doing, whether it's getting students to point out a reason they identified in a passage, to have students share an example, as I did in our vocabulary instruction, but to have daily punctuated opportunities to get a verbal response. So let's review this video clip and notice how adeptly she sets up those frames, has them ready on the board, isn't just entrusting them to their auditory processing, directs their attention, reads them, gets them using them right away, and that students effortlessly and efficiently move into articulating with their partners both a thoughtful and verbally adept response. Let's examine our clip.
I'd like you to think about what word would make the most sense in that sentence and point to that word. Point to the word that you think makes the most sense in the sentence. Then partner number 2 is going to start and tell your partner, I think the word blank makes sense in this sentence. Then partner number 1, you'll say, I agree, or I disagree. I think we should write the word blank. So you're going to talk about your choice. When you both agree, you'll write your choice. Okay? Partner number 2, you're going to begin.
I think the word tiny goes here because it makes sense, because it says weather forecast said there was a tiny chance of hurricane.
Well, I don't agree because later it says soon the rain started, and then you said that there was a tiny chance of rain. So I think it's a excellent chance of a hurricane.
Excellent, but that kind of sounds awkward. Excellent chance of hurricane. I think I'm like only tiny here.
Now that we've reviewed this video clip, you no doubt noticed that Tanya had both of those sentence frames written on the board. She directed their attention, and she had a place carved out in her media real estate, if you will, for sentence frames. That is very important, to have a very easily viewed place in the room to post your response frames, whether it's an easel in front of the room, whether it's a smart board, wherever it is, where students know to look to see what your linguistic tools are that you're supporting with that day. And the second thing I want to point out is the linguistic acumen involved with writing a good response frame. I can tell you from experience, even as someone who's very sensitive to language and who is an applied linguist and a language specialist, that you cannot offer an adept verbal response frame on the fly. That what we tend to do, if you try to do it just as you're going organically through a lesson, is subject our students to a bad draft of a response. We'll often say something like, and I want you to respond with something like this. If our question is, what are characteristics of an effective lesson partner? I want you to think about the characteristics of an effective lesson partner. And my example is, well, the characteristics are an effective lesson partner. Well, if you're going to work effectively with someone, and I see teachers sort of engaging in these sort of machine gun modeling, where they're giving a variety of different responses, but they're sort of chameleon responses, a variation on the theme of the same response, but never a real clear model for students. So I'm strongly suggesting that you prepare these ahead of time, to think of the 3 or 4 places in your lesson where you're going to stop and get a strong verbal response from them, and to think of your responses ahead of time. I know I don't even need to ask how many of you work in mixed ability classrooms, because if you have only one struggling reader or you have only one less proficient English learner, it's actually even more difficult than when you have a whole classroom full of students who are English learners or less proficient readers, or students who are very average in their language abilities and need to be moved on. Or again, my experience with many gifted and talented students is that they're very verbally precocious, but not academically proficient when it comes to language. So they benefit from having linguistic scaffolds too. What I want to think about is, I want to prepare a starter that at least will stretch everyone in the class, but not blow anyone out of the dust. I want to make sure that my starter is developmentally appropriate and can push everyone, but won't be too sophisticated for any single student. But as a backup plan, after my students are familiar using response starters for some critical tasks, some I let them just respond in casual English, but for critical tasks where I want them using target lesson vocabulary and really engaging with the content, I want to have a starter. In mixed ability classrooms, I move fairly quickly into providing more than one starter. What this allows me to do is have a task that everybody accomplishes, but for my fast finishers, who often are more verbally adept, they have a backup plan, because I want them moving, I want them applying new language, and that way we can have more variation as well during the subsequent class discussion. So just to give you an idea of preparing developmentally appropriate response frames, if I'm working in a class, let's say an ELD class or a reading intervention class, and I have a lot of beginning and early intermediate English learners, or I'm in a sheltered class or a push-in, fully inclusive class, I want to make sure that I have a starter that will not totally overwhelm my less proficient language learners. So with the question, what are characteristics of an effective lesson partner? And this is a task that is one of my very first, working with middle school youths, because I use so much structured partnering. I have their first structured discussion actually on this topic, and if I've got a weaker class in terms of their language abilities, my starter is, an effective lesson partner is, and what they have to provide is an adjective, a describing word. So I'll give them a word bank like helpful, polite, prepared, and ask students maybe to get together with their partner and think of one other word that might might provide us a describing word of an effective partner. Get a few words up there for a bank, for a security blanket, for the less proficient language learners in the classroom. So this is not too linguistically demanding. They're using my target word, effective lesson partner, and no one is just saying nice or friendly. Everyone's using an appropriate adjective and a full frame. Now, at another level of complexity, at the intermediate level, and by intermediate, I don't necessarily just mean by English language proficiency by the ELD standards, but just general adolescent language use. And a very average starter might be an effective lesson partner, tries, and then what needs to come after this? We need a base verb, an infinitive verb with two. We need tries to help, tries to assist, tries to complete, tries to participate, tries to respect. We need a base verb. And if we don't model the whole answer and show what needs to come grammatically afterward, I find that students engage in what I call syntactic harakiri. When they respond back with the partner, it starts off valiantly, an effective lesson partner tries, and then it plummets. And they'll say, tries, well, you know, he's really helpful. And the second part just moves into adolescent ease. So I want to really be clear, without going off on a whole grammatical birdwalk, but really clear, you need an action word here. And not just a verb, and it needs to begin with to. And here's a few action words. Get together with your partner to see if you can think of another one. Maybe get another one up here and say, all right, take a moment to prepare your idea. Now, I work in a lot of classrooms with a lot of early intermediate to more early advanced language learners. And often, very precocious middle school youths who don't have a real sophisticated command of academic syntax and vocabulary, but who have sophisticated ideas, and I'm just helping them articulate them in academic discourse. An example at the early advanced level might be, I appreciate working with a partner on lesson task who, and what needs to come after this is the third person singular verb, who tries, who respects, who assists, who enables. And having just modeled a discussion recently in a fully inclusive 8th grade class with native speakers, gifted and talented bilinguals, and students with special needs in the same classroom, a veritable cocktail in terms of proficiency, that I deliberately picked this verb form because I noticed in their writing sample that it was a very persistent error. In fact, leaving off that S on third person singular S is one of the bête noires of English language learners and one of the most persistent dialectical errors. So I wanted to get them to use it and to point it out to them. So what I'm suggesting is not that you need to have sentence starters at every imaginable proficiency level in your classroom, but to begin by at least on a regular basis having a starter that all students could adeptly use, that moves everyone in a more academic register ROM, but that if you have a wide range of abilities, as in the video clips we've witnessed, we really owe it to stretch our more proficient students while pulling up as well our less proficient and average skilled students in terms of language. And one way to accommodate and differentiate is providing a second, more sophisticated starter. And I have a little sobering come to religion talk with my students who've become sort of professional slackers in other classes, who know that they can just do the bare minimum and do fairly well. I want to talk to students that I'm expecting no one is going to sit upright after they've written and just wait, that you're going to move on to the second task, and that if I see anyone sitting up, you're going to be my discussion jumper cable, so that everybody's writing, and that on many levels I've equipped students with more language tools and also had them 100% engaging. I hope it's very apparent that structuring discussion, just as other sessions, topics, focusing on setting up tasks well and implementing them well, teaching vocabulary clearly, is truly a science and an art. We owe it to students on a daily basis to have them leave our classrooms better equipped with oral language than when they entered our classroom. And if we are the only people in the classroom using any academic language in the classroom, we have misserved our students. So I'm going to urge you as colleagues to put your heads together, to think about as colleagues, how can we make sure that every hour of the day our students are flexing their academic language muscles. I'd like you to check out the Taking Center Stage Act 2 web portal. You'll find a host of practical resources that I've included to help you review and get more ideas about how to differentiate instruction in terms of structuring interaction, as well as preparing response frames and getting all students dynamically involved. It's been a pleasure spending time with you. I hope you have some ideas to enhance your repertoire, and look forward to spending time with you again one day soon. Thank you.
You've just seen Dr. Kate Kinsella discuss increasing reading engagement for middle grades students. To find more information and additional resources on this and related topics, go to pubs.cde.ca.gov/TCS2.
in her video clip. In her video clip. In her video clip. In in her video clip. In her video clip.